My name is Clara Whitmore, and I was 36 years old the morning my father called my business a failure for the last time. He said it over breakfast. The kitchen smelled like coffee and cinnamon, and rain tapped softly against the windows over the sink. My mother had made her usual Sunday spread: scrambled eggs, biscuits, fruit, nobody touched, and enough food to feed twice the people sitting around the table. My father believed big breakfasts fixed everything. They never had. I had just poured myself another cup of coffee when he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with that familiar expression, the one that managed to combine pity and disappointment into something sharp. "So," he said, "how's the little company doing?" I should have known better than to answer. "Good," I said. "Actually, really good." My younger brother Ethan looked up from his plate. Dad smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "You always say that." I stirred cream into my coffee. "We signed 3 new clients this month." He nodded slowly. "And we're opening another office." That made him laugh. Actually laugh. He set his fork down and looked around the table as though I'd just told a joke. "A second office? For what? More pretending?" Nobody said anything. The clock over the stove ticked loudly. My mother reached for her coffee. My sister looked at her plate. Dad folded his hands. "Clara, sweetheart, you've been doing this for 6 years. At some point you have to admit it isn't working." "It is working. Real businesses have customers walking through the door." I looked at him. "I have customers. You have emails." Ethan chuckled. I felt my face grow warm. Dad continued. "You know what I think?" I didn't answer. "I think you're stubborn. I think you don't want to admit you made a mistake leaving this family business." There it was. Everything with him always came back to the hardware store. 20 years ago, he'd decided Ethan would inherit it. I'd gone to college. That was apparently betrayal. I set my coffee cup down. "I'm happy with my work." He sighed. "That's because you don't know what success looks like." The words settled over the table. Even Mom looked uncomfortable. Dad shook his head. "One day you'll wake up and realize this little business experiment failed." Experiment, failure, little. He always used those words. Then he smiled again. "You'll come back eventually. Everybody does. Nobody defended me. Nobody ever did." I stood. "I'm heading out." Mom looked up. "You just got here. I've got work." Dad laughed softly. "On a Sunday?" "Yes." He shook his head. "There you go again." I grabbed my purse. As I reached the front door, his voice followed me. "You know, Clara, there's no shame in admitting failure." I stopped. The house became very quiet. Then he added one more sentence. "At least your brother built something real." I left without another word. Outside, rain had started falling harder. I sat in my car and stared through the windshield. It wasn't really anger I felt. It was exhaustion. There is a special kind of tiredness that comes from being underestimated for years. You stop expecting support. You stop expecting kindness. Eventually you stop explaining yourself. I started the engine. My phone buzzed. An email notification appeared. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the sender, First National Commercial Bank. I opened it. The subject line read, "Approval required." I frowned. That wasn't unusual. My company provided operational consulting to several regional businesses, including a few under special lending agreements with the bank. Occasionally, restructuring requests required my sign-off. I opened the attachment, and then I saw the client name, Whitmore Hardware. I read it twice, then a third time. My father's business had submitted an emergency restructuring application. The documents showed declining revenue, overdue vendor payments, and a line of credit that would mature in 30 days. I kept reading. Then I saw another sentence, "Conditionals upon consultant approval." I sat very still. Outside, rain rolled down the windshield. Inside my father's house, he probably still believed my company was a hobby. Meanwhile, his bank had just sent me paperwork that could determine whether his business survived the month. For the first time all morning, I smiled. I didn't drive home. Instead, I drove straight to my office. The building sat at the end of a quiet street downtown, a 2-story brick structure with large windows and a small brass sign that read, "Whitmore Commercial Solutions." I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The office was empty. On Sundays it always was. I turned on the lights and walked slowly to my desk. The rain outside made everything feel smaller and quieter. I set my purse down and opened my laptop. Then I read the documents again. The numbers were worse than I had thought. Much worse. Whitmore Hardware wasn't having a bad month. It was having a bad year. Revenue had been falling for 18 months. Several suppliers were demanding payment. 2 equipment loans were behind. The operating line of credit would come due in 30 days. Without refinancing, my father's business could run out of cash before summer. I leaned back in my chair. I felt something strange. Not satisfaction, not anger, worry, because despite everything my father had said over the years, Whitmore Hardware was still part of my childhood. I grew up there. I spent summers stocking shelves. I knew every squeaky floorboard and every crack in the old wooden counter. I remembered helping my grandfather carry boxes. I remembered my first paycheck. I remembered eating lunch in the tiny office in the back. I remembered believing one day my father would be proud of me. Funny how some hopes stay alive longer than they should. I looked back at the documents. A note from the bank manager had been attached. Clara, because your firm has overseen operational consulting for several regional businesses, and because your recommendations carry significant weight with our commercial lending committee, we would appreciate your review of the enclosed request. Regards, Martin Ellison. I smiled slightly. Dad would hate that. He hated anything that suggested my work mattered. I picked up my phone. I almost called him. I almost told him what I knew. Instead, I put the phone back down. The truth was simple. If he had needed my help 6 months ago, I would have given it. If he had needed my help yesterday, I would have given it. But this morning, he had looked me in the eye and called my life's work a failure. I wasn't angry. I was tired, very tired. I closed the documents and walked to the office window. Rain still covered the glass. A memory surfaced. I was 22 years old, fresh out of college. I had come home excited about a job offer. Dad had been standing behind the counter at the hardware store. I told him I wanted to work in business consulting. He laughed. Not because he thought it was funny, because he thought it was foolish. People don't pay for advice. He had said, I remember every word. Then I told him I didn't want to work at the store. That was the first time he called me selfish. Over the years, the words changed, knave, stubborn, dreamer, failure, but the message stayed the same. I had chosen the wrong life. The phone on my desk rang. I jumped slightly. It was Martin Ellison. I answered. Hello? Clara. Hi, Martin. I assume you've seen the file. I have. There was a pause. I wanted to call personally. Okay. To be transparent, the committee is divided. I sat down. Why? Because the company has serious cash flow problems. I wasn't surprised. And because your recommendations have been very accurate over the years. I looked out the window. What exactly are you asking? We'd like your opinion. I almost laughed. My father would lose his mind if he heard that sentence. The bank wanted my opinion. About his business, Martin continued. The committee meeting is Thursday. That's fast. The situation is urgent. I looked at the file again. Does my father know I received this? No, I closed my eyes. Who approved sending it to me? You did. What? When Whitmore Hardware signed your operational review agreement last year, your company became one of the authorized consultants on record. I opened my eyes. I had forgotten about that. Dad had signed the paperwork himself, probably without reading it. That sounded like him. Martin spoke again. Clara, I'm here. Will you review the request? I was quiet for several seconds. Then I said the only honest thing. Yes. After we hung up, I sat alone in my office. Outside, the rain finally began to stop. I looked at the brass sign on my door reflected in the glass. Whitmore Commercial Solutions. The little company, the failure, the hobby, the business experiment. For 6 years, my father had dismissed it. For 6 years, he had acted as though my work wasn't real. Now, the survival of his company might depend on the judgment of the daughter he never took seriously. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt sad, because sometimes life gives you the proof you've wanted for years, and by the time it arrives, you're too tired to celebrate. I spent the rest of Sunday reading every page in the file. By the time the sun started setting, I knew 3 things. First, Whitmore Hardware was in more trouble than anyone in my family realized. Second, my father had been hiding it. And third, he wasn't going to be able to hide it much longer. The numbers told a story. Numbers always do. Sales had declined for 18 straight months. A large chain store had opened 20 minutes away and was slowly taking customers. Several old accounts had closed. Operating expenses had increased. The store was surviving by borrowing money, and borrowed time eventually runs out. I made coffee and kept reading. There were notes from loan officers, vendor reports, financial statements. Then I found something else. 3 rejected applications. My father had already tried to refinance with other lenders. All 3 had said no. This request to First National wasn't his first option. It was his last. I closed the folder and rubbed my eyes. The office had become dark. I turned on my desk lamp. Its soft yellow light reminded me of the lamp that used to sit on my grandfather's desk at the store. I hadn't thought about him in years. Grandpa Harold believed every person should know how to fix something. A faucet, a cabinet, a relationship, anything. He used to say that things only became useless when people stopped caring enough to repair them. I wondered what he would think of all this. The phone buzzed. Mom. I almost didn't answer. Almost. Hello? Hi, sweetheart. Her voice sounded careful. You left upset this morning. I'm okay. No, you're not. I smiled a little. Mothers know things. I'm fine, Mom, she sighed. Your father didn't mean it. I looked around my empty office. He always means it. Silence. Then she said quietly, he's worried. I frowned. Worried about what? She didn't answer immediately. Things haven't been easy at the store. I sat up straighter. How bad? Another pause. Bad. I already knew that. What do you mean? Your father hasn't been sleeping. I closed my eyes. He says everything is fine. Your father says that about everything. That was true. When did this start? A while ago. I leaned back in my chair. You should have told me. You and your father barely talk anymore. I didn't know what to say to that, she continued. He doesn't know what to do, Clara. There it was, the truth. For the first time in years, I heard fear in my mother's voice. I swallowed. Mom, does Ethan know? I think so. I looked down at the documents. That explained breakfast. People under pressure become strange. Proud people become cruel. Still, it didn't excuse anything. Mom sighed softly. Your father misses you. I almost laughed. He has a funny way of showing it. He doesn't understand you. That sentence hurt more than I expected, because it was true. Dad had never understood me. I liked spreadsheets. I liked planning. I liked solving problems. He liked certainty. He liked tradition. He liked things he could touch. We had spent our entire lives speaking different languages. Mom? Yes? Why didn't he ask for help? I already knew the answer. She gave it anyway. Because he thinks asking you would mean admitting he was wrong. I closed my eyes. There it was again. Pride. The oldest problem in my family. I talked to Mom for another 10 minutes before hanging up. Then I sat quietly in the dark office. The rain had stopped. Cars passed outside. A siren sounded somewhere in the distance. I opened the file again. There was still one question I couldn't answer. Why now? Why had the store declined so quickly? I went back through the statements. Then I saw it. A line item. Equipment financing. I opened the attached schedule. And suddenly I understood. Dad had borrowed heavily 2 years earlier. New delivery trucks, new inventory systems, a warehouse expansion, millions of dollars in debt. I stared at the numbers. He had gambled. And lost. For years, he had mocked my business for being too modern, too different, too risky. Meanwhile, he'd nearly buried the family store trying to compete with companies 10 times his size. I sat there for a long time. Then my phone buzzed again, a text message from Ethan. Dad's in a bad mood. Don't take breakfast personally. I stared at it, then another message arrived. Things are complicated right now. I typed a reply. How complicated? 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, he answered, "Can we talk tomorrow?" I looked at the dark windows. I suddenly had the feeling that my family knew far more than they were saying. And for the first time since receiving the bank's email, I wondered if this story was bigger than a struggling hardware store. Much bigger. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of the bank file. Not even because of breakfast. I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's message. Things are complicated right now. Families only use sentences like that when they've been keeping secrets. Monday morning arrived gray and cold. I was at my office by 7. By 8, I'd already reviewed the hardware store's cash flow projections twice. The numbers still looked terrible. At 8:30, my assistant Marissa knocked on my door. "Your brother is here." I looked up. "My brother?" She nodded. "He says it's important." I took a breath. "Send him in." A few seconds later, Ethan stepped into my office. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his jacket was wrinkled like he'd slept in it. He stood there awkwardly. I'd never invited him to this office before. He looked around. "So this is it. This is it. It's bigger than I expected." I almost smiled. Most people said that. He put his hands into his pockets. "Nice place. Thanks." Silence settled between us. Then he sat down. I waited. Finally he spoke. "Dad's in trouble." I folded my hands. "I know." He blinked. "You know? The bank sent me the file." His face went completely still. "You got the file?" I nodded. He looked genuinely shocked. Then he leaned back slowly. "Wow. What?" "I didn't know you'd become that important." There was no insult in his voice, just surprise. I wasn't sure which felt stranger. I stayed quiet. He rubbed his face. "Okay. Then I guess we should stop pretending." I felt my stomach tighten. "What aren't we pretending anymore?" He looked at me. "The store is falling apart." I already knew that, but hearing him say it made it real. "How bad?" He laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because it wasn't. We might lose it. The room became very quiet. "When? If the refinancing doesn't happen? A month. Maybe less." I stared at him. The family store, the place my grandfather built. The place my father loved more than almost anything. Gone. I hadn't expected the thought to hurt, but it did. Ethan looked at the floor. I didn't know what to do. Why didn't anyone tell me? He looked up. "You and Dad barely speak. So he would have rather gone bankrupt than ask for your help." That sounded exactly like my father. I sighed. "What happened?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "It started 2 years ago." "The expansion?" He looked surprised. "You know about that?" "I saw the loans." He nodded. "Dad thought if we expanded fast enough, we'd beat the chain stores. And we didn't." I closed my eyes briefly. He continued. "We borrowed too much." "Why didn't you stop him?" He laughed again. "You know Dad." Yes, I did. He had never taken advice from anyone, especially not his children. Especially not me. Ethan looked around my office again. "You really built all this?" I looked at him. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Dad always said you weren't doing very well." I almost smiled. "Your father says a lot of things." He actually smiled back. Then his face became serious. "Clara, I need to ask you something." I already knew. "What? Can you help us?" There it was, the question I'd never expected to hear. Not from him. Not like this. I looked out the window. Rain clouds were gathering again. I thought about breakfast. I thought about every insult, every joke, every time Dad called my company fake, every time he told people I would fail. Then I thought about Grandpa's old hardware store. And my answer became much more complicated. Ethan leaned forward. "I know things between you and Dad aren't great." That was an understatement. "But this isn't just his store anymore." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He swallowed. "My house is tied to the business." I blinked. "What? So is Mom and Dad's." I stared at him. "No," he nodded. "Yes." I felt cold. Why? Because Dad needed collateral. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He continued quietly. "If the store goes under, all of us lose our homes." The room seemed to tilt slightly. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, people moved along the sidewalk carrying coffee and umbrellas. Everything looked normal. Inside my office, my entire understanding of the situation had just changed. This wasn't about a hardware store anymore. This was about my family losing everything. I turned back around. Does Mom know? Yes. Does Dad know you came here? No. Why not? He looked at me with tired eyes, because if he knew I was asking for your help, he'd lose his mind. I believed him. Then Ethan said something I never expected. He was wrong about you, Clara. I didn't answer. He always has been. I looked at my brother. For the first time in years, he didn't look like the favored child. He looked scared, really scared, and suddenly I realized something. For all these years, I'd thought my father was the only person who needed to be right. I was wrong. The entire family had been living inside his version of reality, and now that reality was collapsing. After Ethan left, I sat alone in my office for nearly an hour. I didn't work. I didn't answer emails. I simply stared at the file on my desk. My family could lose their homes. The sentence kept repeating in my mind. I thought about my mother and her garden. I thought about my father sitting on the porch every evening. I thought about the old family photographs hanging in their hallway. Then I thought about breakfast. At least your brother built something real. The words still stung. I stood and walked to the coffee machine. I poured myself a cup and looked out the window. At 10:15, my phone rang. The screen said, Dad. I stared at it. He almost never called me. I answered. Hello. There was a long pause, then his voice. Ethan went to see you. It wasn't a question. Yes. Another pause. He had no right. I closed my eyes. Dad, I don't need your help. There it was, pride even now. I never said you did. I know what he's doing. What is he doing? He thinks you can fix this. I sat down. Can I ask you something? What? Why didn't you tell me? Silence. Then he said quietly, because I didn't want your pity. I rubbed my forehead. I wouldn't pity you. I don't need advice either. I almost smiled. Some things never changed. Dad. What? The bank sent me the file. He became very quiet. What? I've reviewed everything. No answer, I continued. The debt, the refinancing, the cash flow problems. I know all of it. His voice changed. You read our numbers? They sent them to me. Another long silence, then he asked a question that surprised me. Why? I realized he genuinely didn't know. Because your company signed an operational review agreement with my firm last year. More silence, then I heard him sigh. I don't remember that. I believed him. He probably signed dozens of documents without reading them. Dad. What? How long have things been this bad? I heard him exhale. A while. That's not an answer. Another pause. Since last year. I looked at the papers. The numbers suggested longer. Try again. No answer. Dad. Finally, he said, 2 years. I closed my eyes. 2 years. 2 years of pretending. 2 years of Sunday breakfasts and normal conversations and jokes and family dinners, all while everything was falling apart. Why didn't you say something? His answer came immediately. Because I could fix it. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was tragic. People like my father always think they can fix everything alone. Even when they're drowning, especially when they're drowning. Dad, what? You can't borrow your way out of this. Silence. You sound like the bank. Maybe the bank has a point. His voice hardened. I didn't call for a lecture. Then why did you call? He didn't answer. I waited. Finally he said, I don't want you involved. I stared at the phone. It was unbelievable. The man was standing in the middle of a fire and refusing a bucket of water. Why? Because this is family business. I laughed softly. I couldn't help it. What? You still say that, because it's true. No, Dad, it isn't. Silence. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say. The truth is, you stopped thinking of me as family business 20 years ago. Nothing. I kept going. You decided I didn't matter the day I chose a different career. That's not fair. I almost smiled. There it was, the sentence people use when the truth finally arrives. Really? You know I love you. I closed my eyes. I hadn't expected that. Not today, not now. Then why do you treat me like a disappointment? The question hung between us. I could hear him breathing. But he didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer. Finally, he said quietly, I thought you'd come back. The words caught me off guard. What? I thought you'd work at the store. I said nothing. I thought one day you'd realize this was where you belonged. For the first time, he didn't sound angry. He sounded tired, old. I suddenly understood something. My father had been waiting 20 years for a future that never happened. And every year I succeeded somewhere else, it reminded him of what he didn't get. I wasn't his failure. I was his disappointment. Those are different things, much different. He spoke again. I never understood your work. I know. I still don't. I smiled sadly. I know that too. Silence. Then he asked very quietly, is it really doing that well? I looked around my office, at the framed awards on the wall, at the employees working in rooms beyond my door, at everything I'd built. Yes. He didn't speak. I realized something. For the first time in 6 years, he was finally asking. I didn't answer him right away. There are moments in life when someone asks a question that is 20 years late. You still answer it, but you answer it differently than you would have before. Yes, I said softly. It's doing very well. I heard him take a breath, then another. What exactly do you do? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because my father had never asked me that question. Not once. Not in 6 years. Not when I started the company. Not when I hired employees. Not when I bought this office. Never. I looked out my window. I help businesses solve problems. What kind of problems? Financial ones, operational ones, contract issues, growth planning. He was quiet. And people pay you for that? Quite a lot, actually. Another long silence. Then he said something so quietly I almost missed it. I didn't know. I closed my eyes. I believed him. He really didn't know, because he had never wanted to know. There is a difference. Dad. What? Why did you call me a failure yesterday? He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired. I don't know. That's not true. No, he admitted. It isn't. I waited. Then he said, because every time I saw you succeed somewhere else, it reminded me that you didn't want this place. The words landed softly, not cruelly, just honestly. I leaned back in my chair. I never said I didn't want the family. I know. You acted like I did. I know. Silence, then he sighed. When your grandfather died, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with all of you here. I looked down at the papers. But people leave. I didn't leave you. No, he said quietly. You left the store. It was the same thing his generation always confused. The building and the people. The business and the family. I spoke gently. They're not the same thing. I know that now. I didn't expect those words. I sat very still. Then he asked, how bad is it? There it was, the real reason for the phone call. The question he didn't want to ask. I looked at the file. Bad. Silence. How bad? I took a breath. If nothing changes, you could lose the business. Nothing. And the houses? I closed my eyes. They're at risk. The silence that followed was so long I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Finally, he spoke. Your mother doesn't know that. Then you should tell her. I can't. Why? Because I already knew. Because saying something out loud makes it real. I heard him exhale slowly. I thought I could fix it before anyone found out. I rubbed my forehead. Dad, you've been trying for 2 years. I know. His voice cracked slightly. Just slightly. It was enough. I suddenly pictured him sitting alone in his kitchen late at night, staring at bills. I pictured him lying awake. I pictured him carrying all of this by himself. For the first time since receiving the bank's email, I stopped seeing my father as the man who had insulted me at breakfast. I saw an aging man who was scared. That didn't erase the hurt. But it changed the shape of it. He cleared his throat. The bank meeting is Thursday. Yes. Will you be there? I looked out the window. Do you want me there? Silence, then very quietly. I don't know. I smiled sadly. That was the most honest thing he'd said all day. I'll be there. He didn't answer. Then he said something unexpected. Your grandfather would have understood your work. I blinked. What? He liked people who fixed things. I stared at the desk. I think he would have been proud of you. The words hit me so suddenly that I couldn't speak. My grandfather had been gone for 14 years. And somehow hearing that from my father mattered more than I wanted it to. I swallowed. Thank you. Neither of us spoke for a while, then he said, "I should go, okay. Clara?" "Yes? I'm sorry about breakfast." The words were awkward and incomplete, but they were real. And for my father, that was something close to extraordinary. I smiled. "It's okay." "No," he said softly. "I don't think it is." A moment later, the call ended. I sat there for a long time. Then I looked around my office, at the people working beyond the glass walls, at the company I'd built, at the life I'd made. For years, I thought I wanted my father to understand my success. I was wrong. What I wanted was much simpler. I wanted him to see me, and for the first time in a very long time, I thought he finally might. Thursday arrived faster than I expected. The entire week seemed to move in strange, uneven pieces. I worked. I attended meetings. I answered emails. But a part of my mind remained fixed on one thing, the bank meeting. By Thursday morning, I'd reviewed Whitmore Hardware's numbers so many times I could practically recite them. I knew every debt, every payment, every risk. I also knew something else. The business could still be saved, but not in the way my father wanted. At 9:45, I parked outside First National Commercial Bank. The sky was gray again. It seemed to rain every important day of my life. I walked inside carrying a folder and found Martin Ellison waiting in the lobby. He smiled. "Good morning, Clara! Morning! You came!" I said I would. He nodded. "I appreciate it." We walked together toward the conference room. As we reached the door, I stopped. Through the glass wall, I could see my father. And for the first time in my life, he looked old. Really old. His shoulders seemed smaller. His hair looked grayer. He sat beside Ethan, staring at the table. The sight hurt more than I expected. Martin opened the door. Everyone looked up. My father looked surprised to see me, then nervous, then something else. Relief. I hadn't expected that. I sat across from him. No one spoke for a moment. Finally, Martin cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming." The meeting began. Numbers filled the next 20 minutes. Cash flow, debt schedules, vendor obligations. I already knew everything being discussed. My father barely spoke. Ethan answered most questions. Eventually, Martin folded his hands. "The situation is serious." Silence. "We believe the company can survive." I saw my father sit straighter. "But only with significant changes." The hope faded again. Martin looked at me. "Ms. Whitmore has reviewed the file." My father glanced toward me. I suddenly realized something. This was the first business meeting we'd ever attended together. And somehow I had become the expert in the room, Martin continued. "We would like her opinion." The room became quiet. I opened my folder. I looked at the numbers one last time, then I closed it. "The business can be saved." My father exhaled. "But not like this." Silence, I continued. "The debt structure isn't sustainable." No one interrupted. The expansion failed because it happened too quickly. I looked at my father. "You borrowed money to solve a competitive problem that money couldn't solve." He lowered his eyes. I continued. "The store needs to become smaller before it can become stronger." Martin nodded. I went on. "You need to sell the warehouse." Ethan looked surprised. "You need to reduce inventory." I turned another page. "You need to close 2 supplier accounts." I looked at my father again. "And you need to stop pretending the business is still what it was 10 years ago." The room became very quiet. No one moved. Then I said the hardest part. "You also need help." My father looked at me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly, "From who?" I smiled a little. "From people who know things you don't." To my surprise, a few people laughed softly. Even Martin. My father didn't. He simply looked tired. Then he asked another question. "Can it survive?" I answered honestly, "Yes." A long pause. "And the houses? They can be protected." I watched relief spread slowly across his face. Then Martin said something that changed everything. "The committee is prepared to approve the restructurings." Silence. "Commendable upon consultant oversight." I already knew that. My father didn't. He looked confused. "What does that mean?" Martin looked at me, then back at him. "It means Miss Whitmore's firm would oversee implementation." The room became completely still. I watched my father process the sentence again and again, then he looked at me, at my folder, at the bank officers, at Martin, then back at me. The bank wants her? Martin smiled politely. We trust her judgment. No one said anything. Finally, my father spoke, very softly. Nobody moved. The little company. I swallowed. He looked around the room, then back at me. They're trusting the business I said wasn't real. I didn't answer, because there wasn't anything to say. A long silence followed. Then my father did something I had never seen him do. He stood up, he looked directly at me, and he said, I was wrong. Nobody in that room moved. I don't think anyone expected those words. I know I didn't. My father had never apologized easily. In fact, I could count on one hand the number of times I'd heard him admit he was wrong. Yet there he stood in the middle of a conference room, looking older than his 68 years, saying the one thing I had stopped hoping to hear. I was wrong. The room remained completely silent. Then he sat back down, slowly, carefully, like the sentence itself had taken something out of him. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said quietly, Thank you. He nodded once. Nothing more. Martin cleared his throat. Then shall we discuss next steps? The meeting continued. For another hour, we reviewed every detail, debt restructuring, Axiet sales, operational changes, vendor negotiations, Shaw's flow projections. By the end of it, everyone looked exhausted. But there was something else in the room now. Hope. Real hope. For the first time in 2 years, the store had a path forward. It wouldn't be easy. There would be sacrifices. The warehouse would be sold, several employees would need to be reassigned, the business would become smaller, but it would survive. Eventually, Martin closed his folder. Then, we're agreed. Everyone nodded. The meeting was over. People stood, papers were gathered, chairs slid across the carpet. Then something unexpected happened. My father stayed seated, everyone else slowly left the room. Within 2 minutes, only 3 people remained. Me, my father, Ethan. My brother looked between us. Then he smiled faintly. I think you two should talk. A moment later, he quietly walked out. The door closed. For the first time in years, my father and I were alone. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked around the conference room. This is strange. What is? Being the least knowledgeable person in the room. I laughed softly. He smiled a little, then he looked at me. I really didn't know. I know. I thought your company was. He stopped. What? He shook his head. Never mind. I smiled. No, say it, he sighed. I thought it was small. It started small. I thought you were struggling. I struggled at first. I thought. He stopped again. I waited. Then he looked down at the table. I thought you'd eventually come back. There it was again. That old hope. I suddenly realized something. For 20 years, my father had been grieving a future that never existed. No wonder my success had always made him uncomfortable. It reminded him that the future he imagined wasn't coming. He looked up. You built something impressive. The words landed softly. I smiled. Thank you. I should have said that years ago. I didn't answer. He looked tired, very tired. I spent so much time being disappointed that you didn't choose my life that I never stopped to appreciate the life you actually built. The room became quiet. Then he laughed softly. And apparently, it's a pretty good one. I laughed too. Then he became serious. Why did you help us? The question surprised me. What do you mean? After everything. I thought about it. Then I gave him the truth. Because losing the store would have hurt me too. He looked surprised. I continued. You always thought I left because I didn't care. I shook my head. I left because I wanted something different. I looked out the window. But it's still my family's store. The silence that followed felt different, lighter. Then he said quietly, I've been unfair to you. I looked back at him. Yes. To my surprise, he smiled. You always were honest. You asked. He nodded. Then he said something that made my throat tighten. I'm proud of you. I forgot how to breathe. I had wanted those words when I was 22. I wanted them when I was 25. I wanted them when I was 30. At 36, I had almost stopped needing them. Almost. And yet hearing them now still mattered. A lot. I swallowed. Thank you. Neither of us said anything for a while, then he stood. "I think your grandfather would have liked this." "What? You fixing my mess?" I smiled. "Probably." He nodded. Then he held out his hand. I looked at it. Then I looked at him. For a moment we both seemed to realize how strange the gesture was. Then I stood and shook his hand. After a second he pulled me into a hug. It lasted only a few moments. But it was enough. Sometimes relationships don't heal all at once. Sometimes they simply stop breaking. And that's enough to begin. The story should have ended there. Most people think life works that way. A problem appears, someone apologizes. Everyone learns a lesson. The credits roll. Real life isn't like that. Real life keeps going. The Monday after the bank meeting, I walked into the hardware store for the first time in nearly 8 years. Nothing had changed. The bell over the door still rang too loudly. The floors still creaked. The old coffee machine still sat beside the register. For a moment I felt like I was 20 years old again. Then I noticed the empty aisles, the missing inventory, the worn displays. The place looked tired, just like my father. He came out of the back office carrying a box. When he saw me, he smiled, actually smiled. "You came, you asked." He nodded. I wasn't sure. I looked around. "You've got a lot of work ahead of you." He laughed softly. That's one way to say it. Over the next few weeks, I became a regular visitor. At first, it felt strange. I reviewed contracts, negotiated with suppliers, analyzed inventory. Implement new systems. The employees stared at me as if I had suddenly appeared from another planet. Many of them had known me since I was a child. Most of them still thought I worked in an office somewhere doing mysterious things with computers. The truth was much less exciting. I spent 3 hours one afternoon reviewing invoices. I spent another day reorganizing vendor agreements. Real business is rarely glamorous. It's mostly paperwork and decisions. By the second week, something interesting started happening. Dad began asking questions. Lots of questions. What does this spreadsheet mean? Why are we tracking this? How did you know that supplier would agree? At first, I thought it was amusing. Then I realized something. He was trying to understand my world. For the first time, one afternoon we were sitting in his office reviewing sales reports. He looked at me. "So this is what you do all day?" I laughed. "More or less." He leaned back in his chair. I had no idea. I smiled. "I know." He looked around the office, then he said something unexpected. "I think I would have been terrible at your job." I laughed again. "You would have." To my surprise, he laughed too. A month earlier, that conversation would have been impossible. People really can change, slowly, awkwardly, but they can. 3 months later, the warehouse sold, the debt was reduced, cash flow improved, the business stabilized. Not perfectly, but enough. One Friday afternoon, Martin called me. "I thought you'd like to know." "What?" "The committee officially removed Whitmore Hardware from the high-risk list." I smiled. "That's good news." "It's excellent news." After we hung up, I drove straight to the store. Dad was stocking shelves. I handed him my phone. "What am I looking at?" "Read it." He adjusted his glasses. Then he smiled. A real smile. The kind I hadn't seen in years. "We did it." "No," I said. "You did it." He shook his head. "No." He looked around the store, then back at me. "We did it." That evening, the whole family gathered for dinner. For the first time in a long time, nobody seemed tense. Nobody argued. Nobody pretended. Halfway through dessert, my mother stood up. "I have something to say." Everyone looked at her. She smiled. "I'm proud of both my children." The room became quiet. She looked at me. I should have said it years ago. Then she looked at Ethan. "And I'm proud of you too." My brother smiled. Then Mom looked at Dad. "And I'm proud of you for finally listening." Everyone laughed, even him. Later that night, as I was leaving, Dad walked me to my car. The summer air felt warm. Crickets chirped somewhere in the distance. He stood beside me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You know something?" "What?" "I don't think your company was ever the failure." I smiled. "No?" He shook his head. "I think my imagination was." I looked at him. He continued. "I had one idea of what success looked like." He smiled sadly. "And I almost missed yours completely." That conversation stayed with me. I think because it was the first time my father and I were looking at the same thing and seeing it the same way. Doc says. For years we'd defined it differently. To him, success was staying. To me, success was building. Neither of us had been completely wrong. We'd just been standing in different places. Summer turned into autumn. The hardware store slowly recovered, not perfectly, not dramatically, but steadily. The kind of progress that doesn't make headlines but changes lives anyway. I visited the store twice a week, then 3 times. Eventually, it became normal. One Tuesday afternoon, I walked in and found my father teaching a teenage employee how to read a sales report. I stopped in the doorway. 6 months earlier, he would have called a spreadsheet unnecessary. Now he was explaining margins and inventory turnover. He looked up and caught me watching. What? I smiled. Nothing. He narrowed his eyes. You've got that look. What look? The one where you're judging me. I laughed. I'm not judging you. You are. Maybe a little. He grinned. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed seeing him laugh. One evening in October, we stayed late closing the store. After the employees left, we sat on the front steps. The street was quiet. The air smelled like fallen leaves. Dad looked out at the parking lot. You know something funny? What? When you were little, I thought you were the child most likely to take over this place. I looked at him. Really? Oh, yes. I laughed. Why? You organized everything. I smiled. You labeled your toys. I laughed harder. You were 8 years old and had a filing system. I remember. I thought this kid is going to run the world someday. I looked at him. Then what happened? He was quiet for a long time. Then he answered honestly. I got attached to my own idea of your future. I nodded slowly. I think parents do that sometimes. He looked at me. I think you're right. Then he smiled sadly. The problem is that children grow into themselves instead. We sat quietly for a while, then he said something unexpected. I was angry because you didn't need this place. I looked at him. I needed this place. He shook his head. No. He looked toward the store. I needed this place. I didn't say anything. I built my entire identity around this business. He smiled softly. When it started struggling, I didn't know who I was anymore. The honesty of that sentence surprised me. Then I realized something. For 2 years, my father hadn't only been afraid of losing the store. He'd been afraid of losing himself. That kind of fear makes people say terrible things. It doesn't excuse them. But it explains them. I looked at him. You know who you are? He smiled. No, I think I'm still figuring that out. I laughed softly. At 68, apparently. We sat there until the sun disappeared. Then he stood. I have something for you. He disappeared inside the store. A minute later, he returned carrying a small wooden box. I frowned. What's that? Open it. I lifted the lid. Inside was an old brass nameplate. I recognized it immediately. Whitmore Hardware, founded by Harold Whitmore. I looked up. This was Grandpa's. Dad nodded. He kept it on his desk. I touched the metal carefully. It's beautiful. He wanted you to have it. I looked at him in surprise. What? He told me years ago. I felt my throat tighten. He said one day you'd build something of your own. I couldn't speak. Dad smiled. He said you'd need a nameplate. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. He really said that? He did. I looked down at the brass plate. For years I'd wondered whether Grandpa would have understood my choices. Now I knew. He had, long before anyone else. Dad put his hands into his pockets. He was right. I looked up. You built something worth putting your name on. I swallowed hard. Then I smiled. For the first time in a very long time, I felt something settle inside me. Not pride, not victory. Something quieter. Something better. Peace. Winter arrived early that year. The first snow came in November, covering the town in white and turning the hardware store into something that looked like a postcard. One Saturday morning, I drove over with coffee and found my father standing outside, staring at the sign. What are you doing? I asked. He smiled. Thinking? About what? He looked at the building. I almost lost this place. I stood beside him. Almost. He nodded. Funny thing is, losing it isn't what scares me anymore. I looked at him. No? He shook his head. What scares me is how close I came to losing my family while trying to save a building." The words hung in the cold air, then he smiled softly. "I think I finally understand something." "What?" He looked at me. "Success isn't making your children live the life you imagined." I said nothing. "It's having the wisdom to appreciate the life they build for themselves." I smiled. "That's pretty good." He laughed. "You should write it down." We went inside. The store was busy. Customers moved through the aisles and employees carried boxes and answered questions. It looked alive again, not because everything had been fixed, because people had finally started fixing it together. That afternoon, while helping organize the office, I found an old photograph in a drawer. It showed my grandfather standing in front of the store with my father and me. I couldn't have been more than 10 years old. I was smiling. Grandpa was smiling. Dad looked younger than I remembered. I carried the picture into the front of the store. Dad took it. He stared at it for a long time, then he laughed. "You had those terrible overalls. They were fashionable." "They absolutely were not." I laughed. Then he handed the photo back. "You know, I spent years thinking you left all of this behind." I looked at the picture. "I never did." He nodded slowly. "I know." A few weeks later, I hung Grandpa's brass nameplate on the bookshelf in my office. Right beneath it, I placed the photograph. People asked about it all the time. I always smiled and said the same thing. It's a reminder. A reminder that success can look different than we expect. A reminder that people can change. A reminder that being understood sometimes takes longer than we think. Most of all, it's a reminder that the people who underestimate you don't always stay that way. Sometimes they learn. Sometimes they apologize. Sometimes they finally see you. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they become proud of you, long after you stopped asking them to be. Last week, my father called me. He needed help reading a supplier agreement. I drove to the store, sat beside him, and spent an hour explaining the contract. When we finished, he smiled. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I smiled back. "Probably sign something expensive." He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Then he looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "You didn't fail, Clara." I waited. He smiled. "I just didn't understand what success looked like until it was sitting across the table from me." That's my story. One struggling hardware store, one bank meeting, and one father who finally learned that the little company he called a failure had been strong enough to save the family business all along.